friends, this is the third presentation
And final.
by Linda Woodward, Professor of Art History in the Lone Star College System. So we'll let Linda start.
Okay, I'm glad y'all could come. Let me go over to my area here and we'll continue with the lecture. Today's lecture is going to be about early church architecture. And I can remember when I was in graduate school and had to take an architecture class, even in undergraduate, I thought, you know, I think I would rather watch paint dry. I was interested in domicile architecture, in other words, the design of a house. Not so much large buildings, but when we got to church architecture, all of a sudden, you know, I was alert and awake. So today we're only going to cover church architecture from the very beginning until the 12th century, and that would be Romanesque. Okay, so we'll go through probably periods that you're not familiar with. So let's get started. The first thing I want to talk to is about the hand. That is the hand of Constantine. It's what we have left of a colossal statue of him. It's quite huge. But let's go to the next one. The very first, or the most early evidence that we have of a structure for worship is the meeting house, the early Christian meeting house. It is basically a fallacy that early Christians worshipped in the catacombs. If you were at the Jesus lecture a few Sundays ago, I told you that the catacombs were not a pleasant place, that you would not want to spend much time down there. And I think even today the bacteria is more than I would want to deal with. But the early Christian meeting house is such that it could accommodate small groups of people. People could have lived in this, and this would have been before 313. Before 313. So this is probably late 2nd to early 3rd century. They gathered in homes, and it was mentioned actually in Acts 17:5 and 20:20, and in Corinthians 16:19, or in Jewish worship places like the Second Temple or synagogues, which is mentioned in Acts chapter 2, verse 46. Now, the Dura Europa meeting house is at this point the oldest one we know, but there are others out there that are going to be starting to be verified, so we don't know if this will stay forever. Remember that Dura Europa, where this early meeting house was, is on the Euphrates River in eastern Roman Syria. It was a house that came into Christian possession and was remodeled approximately 240 AD. 2 rooms were combined to form the assembly room, and another room became a baptistry. The baptistry was the only room decorated with pictures. Most of Dura Europa was destroyed by the Sasanian Persians in 256, but more importantly, ISIS came in and bombed them this past century. I think it was 2013 maybe, I may be wrong on that, so don't hold me to it. But if you look, there's a central courtyard, and then there's a baptistry you can see from the legend there. I actually have a picture before, this is before, I guess, the bombing. I don't know if it still remains. But this is from Dura Europa, and this is what we have uncovered archaeologically from the Christian meeting house. Let's go to this one. This statue probably changed the world that we know today. This is Constantine. The date of this is around 312 AD. It is a colossal statue. This is all that we have left. Somewhere there's also a foot, but there is a hand, part of a limb, and Constantine. And if you remember from my other lectures, Constantine has an otherworldly look, doesn't he? He looks like he's off into another dimension, which is a kind of a change for Romans. Remember that Roman art was very naturalistic. It was very much about the here and now. So this statue, I say, is key for changing us into what we are today. Now, this structure, which I have visited and spent some time in, is the Basilica of Constantine, also known as the Basilica of Maxentius. And if you can recall, there was a battle at the Milvian Bridge where Constantine fought Maxentius. Constantine won, and threw Maxentius in the Tiber. Now, what is so important about this building? This is a Roman basilica. So you may say, okay, what does basilica mean to you all?
Church.
Church. But in this case, the very origins of the basilica we know today is the law building. This is almost a beautiful cross-section. Can you see the 3 arches, and then can you see that there are aisles that go through those arches? This will be the design for churches that has permeated for the most part till today. Okay? Now, many times churches are built over temples. And one of the questions my students said is, why did they pick the law building instead of the temple? I mean, there were temples everywhere. They could have just converted them over to churches. Well, there's an issue with the temple. You can see on the left that there's a Greek temple, and you can see the interior. But here's the thing about the Greek temple. Nobody went inside except officials and important temple-related people. Okay? So, on the inside, all we have is the cella. You see the central room? We have the cella. And then there's a cult statue in the cella. So there's a large statue. So if it was to Athena, there would be a large statue of Athena. And in fact, there was in the Parthenon. Now, see the back room with the 4 posts? That was where they kept the treasury. So, if you wanted to convert this over into a Christian church, what would be the obstacle? Who comes to the Christian church? Everybody, right? Could they fit inside there? No. So they chose the law building. There's another reason for that. Can someone delve into what Christ is about and tell me why the law building fits for Christianity? Christ will come to judge the living and the dead. What happens in the law building? Judgment. So what is the appeal of Christianity over the religions of the Roman Empire? Well, I need to let you know that by the 1st and 2nd century, educated Romans didn't really believe in that state religion. It was fine, they had their ceremonies and everything, but the credibility of the religion was failing. The empire was held up by the religion, but in fact it was failing. The other thing is that the Roman Empire expanded all the way around the Mediterranean. So if it's expanding all the way around the Mediterranean, what are they exposed to? Battle and other religions. So the religion of the Roman Empire, so long as it didn't try and undermine the empire, was fine. And in fact, the most fascinating thing that I've heard is that they found a temple to Isis in England. How did that happen? Hear the marching of the army? They carried religion. If we got an army together here in Humboldt, there would be multiple religions. And in fact, so long as the Christians didn't undermine the authority of the emperor, it was fine. It was when Christianity said, we have a higher authority we answer to over the emperor, that got them in trouble. That's when Diocletian threw them to the lions. You know, you can't have that.
Right.
So that's the story. So do you all understand why the law building was chosen? And it carries through today. It carries through today.
What century was that again?
Third. Actually, no, fourth is it was 312, so 4th century.
We're at the top of the Aventine Hill in Rome, at the Basilica of Santa Sabina.
This dates to the 400s, only about 100 years or so after Constantine legalizes Christianity.
It's got a fabulous view of the city of Rome, and it feels like an important place.
The great ancient Roman temples were on nearby hills, like on the Capitoline Hill was the ancient pagan temple dedicated to Jupiter. And so it made sense to be here to speak of the new official religion of the Roman Empire.
Now, the early Christians did not invent an entirely new architecture. Instead, they looked back to large-scale building from ancient Rome. They repurposed the basilica. This was, in ancient pagan Rome, an administrative structure. It's interesting to compare the religious structures of the pagan and the Christian. When we think of a Greek or Roman temple, we're thinking of a house for the god or goddess being honored, and it would not have much interior space, often just enough for the cult sculpture.
But a basilica is a great structure for the early Christians because it could hold huge numbers of people. It had a sense of imperial authority. It was a government building, and so it was associated with the empire, and as an official religion, you would want to communicate that. The other important thing was that a basilica could have a longitudinal axis. That is, it could focus attention on the opposite end to the entrance, and so large numbers of people could gather for the liturgy with a focus on the altar.
And we see that here at Santa Sabina. Each of those enormous arches creates a visual rhythm that leads our eye down to this critical point.
Art historians like to talk about how at Santa Sabina we get a sense of what Old St. Peter's looked like. Now, Old St. Peter's was important because it was built by Constantine. So when he legalized Christianity, he set about building the first churches in important cities all over the empire. And here in Rome, he commissioned the building of Old St. Peter's, which got rebuilt in the Renaissance.
But the original St. Peter's was about 100 years older than Santa Sabina, so this building gives us a sense of what that building looked like. However, that building did have a couple of important differences. It was much larger than Santa Sabina. It was on an imperial scale, but also importantly, the ceiling of the nave was truss, and it had a double aisle on either side of the nave to help accommodate movement of so many people through that space.
The old St. Peter's and the new St. Peter's rebuilt in the Renaissance was the burial place of St. Peter, and so it was a very important pilgrimage site, so it had to accommodate large numbers of people. But it's so wonderful that we get some sense of what that church commissioned by Constantine looked like when we go into Santa Sabina.
There's one particularly interesting element in the porch. Let's take a look at it before we go inside.
We're looking at a carved wooden doorway that dates from the 5th century. Now, it's been heavily restored, but it's remarkable that a wooden doorway carved with scenes from the Old and New Testament survives from the 5th century.
Generally, organic materials like wood don't last this long, but there's one particular scene that is interesting to art historians, and it's all the way in the upper left corner of the door. It may be one of the very first examples of a crucifixion.
It's especially interesting because in most early Christian art, we don't see the resurrection or the crucifixion. Mostly have a focus on Christ's ministry and miracles.
Well, we don't actually see the cross. What we see is a large central figure with his arms out, and then on either side are two smaller figures, presumably the two thieves that were crucified on either side of Christ. So let's go inside.
We've entered Santa Sabina. The space is quite open. We get a very clear view through the nave and one aisle on either side down toward the apse where the altar is. The apse is that semicircular space opposite the entrance of the church. And unlike so many other later churches, it doesn't have a transept. That is, an aisle that went across at one end of the church. But here we have a very simple space with the nave, the apse on one end, and one aisle on either side.
The space is beautifully and softly lit by sunlight coming in from a clear story. It's interesting to note that there's not glass in there, but a crystalline form of gypsum instead that lets in a tremendous amount of light. Now, this particular church has a flat ceiling above the nave with enormous wooden beams that help to support it. It has a pitched roof above that. But one of the most distinctive features of this church is the glorious columns that line either side of the nave. This is spolia. These are columns that were reused from a pagan building and here have been repurposed in this Christian context.
And these columns carry a nave arcade of arches.
In the spectrals of the arches facing the nave are images created out of inlaid stone that show a chalice and bread plates. And so repeatedly down the length of the nave, we have a reference to the Eucharist.
And we see that also in the apse. The Eucharist, or Holy Communion, is part of the Christian liturgy where the priest enacts the sacrifice and resurrection of Christ by offering the bread and the wine, which are miraculously the body and blood of Christ.
This building type will go on to be a source for the architecture of Christian churches throughout the rest of history.
Although mostly with a transept, which comes to signify the cross that Christ was crucified on. Between the nave arcade and the clerestory, we have a wall that in most early Christian churches would have contained decoration, fresco or mosaic, like in the Church of Sant'Apollinare Nuovo in Ravenna, but here those decorations are gone.
One of the other most appealing features of this church is the screen, which separates the sanctuary from the nave. It is elaborately carved. So Santa Sabina gives us a sense of what the earliest Christian buildings looked like as it looks back to the pagan tradition. But at the same time, it also sets up the form that so many Christian churches after will follow.
Like so many churches in Rome, over the centuries, the space has been transformed. There are 2 Baroque chapels that have been added, but so much remains of Santa Sabina's original form that we really do get to be transported back in time to the 5th century.
Okay, here we are back at Santa Sabina, which is 432, so 5th century. Someone said, is this really how it looks? Yes, this is the original structure. And it's interesting to note that there were so many churches that were burned, because remember, Rome fell around year 500, more or less, because the barbarians from the north came in and invaded, and they burned churches. So this remained because it was made of brick. And remember that the Romans, early Romans, used brick for structures. And the other interesting thing is, and when I went to Rome, I saw it firsthand in some of the ruins, is that with the Romans, they would build 2 walls to make it very thick, like a brick wall here and a brick wall there. Then they would fill the inside with rubble. So any kind of construction rubble, cement, okay? The Romans were the ones who used cement in building. So they were very good at structures. And in fact, that's why. I have never seen gypsum windows before. So this is the only church that I've seen that has it. Now, on the inside, I'm going to ease you in gradually to some terminology. And someone had asked for a vocabulary list, and I don't think she's here today, but I did a vocabulary list. Okay, where those people are standing, that central part is the nave. And in early Christian churches, they did not have pews. Everybody stood. And there was a lot of meandering around, okay, during the Mass. So if we're standing where we are, right in the center, we're in the nave. And if you see where there's a wall, that is the choir. And that's kind of a walled-off area where either the choir or bishops or important people would be in there. Maybe not bishops, because they would be off to the side with a separate chair. Then the altar is behind the choir. We don't have that now, do we? No. Now, the area, you see the semicircular area with the 3 windows? That is the apse. And in the Basilica of Constantine, that large colossal statue that we saw the remains of would have been put in that niche. Okay, so from there we get the whole orientation of the church. Okay, any questions on that? If you look, you see the columns in a row going down? That is, if the center is the nave, that wall on either side is the nave arcade wall. So some of you may say, what is an arcade? An arcade is a series of columns and arches. Okay? And go ahead.
What is that scene over the
Those 3 windows.
3 windows, yeah.
The scene over the 3 windows.
Oh, the scene. Oh, I don't know. I'm not close enough to really see it. I don't have it in my slides. I chose Santa Pudenziana for that scene over, because I don't think I got very much information over it.
So the idea of pews was what came about when, Linda?
Oh my gosh, I've got it in my notes and it'll
Okay.
come up, so I
Okay.
promise you,
Okay.
I promise you.
Mhm.
So people would stand then?
Mhm.
It was
They would
a-
stand.
Yeah, they aren't,
I
yeah.
figured they gathered.
Yeah.
They would gather there, and once a pulpit emerges, they'll wander over to the pulpit when they're talking. A term that I was not overly familiar with from graduate school, but came up here, is the term ambo. And can someone tell me what the ambo is, or the
That's
ambos?
where the readings are done.
Readings.
The readings are done from there. It comes from a Greek word meaning step or elevation. Since the 4th century, Christians were accustomed to using a raised platform during Mass to chant or read the epistle and the gospel. Some historians believe it is connected to the platform used by Jewish rabbis to read the scriptures. Spiritually, it is derived from the action of Jesus when he went up on the mountain, opened his mouth, and taught them, and that's from Matthew. Now, it's interesting, whenever we talk about things, and I'll say, well, something came up, something always comes from something else, doesn't it? It's almost like a recycle and reuse, just like they did with the columns in here. A lot of times they took down temples and took parts of the temple, like those columns, and put them in. So everything comes from somewhere else. As the liturgy developed, 2 ambos were put in place to distinguish between the epistle and the gospel. The epistle ambo was located on the southern side of the sanctuary, while the gospel ambo was located on the northern side. Ambos were designed in various ways, always with a place for the book to be read, with several steps leading up to it. By the 14th century, so that's the 1300s, the use of ambos was in steady decline in Europe. Immediately succeeding the ambo in liturgical function was the pulpit. The word stems from the Latin pulpitum, which originally was used to denote a theatrical stage. In medieval churches, it became a platform primarily used for preaching. The pulpit was located in the center of the nave, so not down where we see it today, but in the center of the nave or over to the side, but midway, not all the way to the end. And the people would walk over there and listen. So there's a lot of moving around. It also was highly elevated to allow the priest to adequately address the congregation. Here's the answer to the question someone had. Pews did not enter into the church until after the Protestant Reformation. So 16th century.
So is that the reason it was brought up? Because of the...
You want to speak up, Estella?
I said, is that the reason that came about, because of the Reformation?
It could be. It could be. I'm not, it was never attributed. It just said until after the Reformation. So maybe the Reformation brought in seats and then we did. I'm not really sure.
Thank God for that.
Amen. Although some of
Also, the
those
Mass was
Jews
much
did.
longer, remember? Us growing up, the Mass was longer.
Oh, yeah.
Much longer. Okay. Here's a little better view from the choir. This is the choir area. Is it better if we turn the lights out?
Maybe.
Let's see, Jim, if it works better. Yeah, I can read.
Yeah.
Is that better for y'all?
Yes.
Yes.
Here's the plan. It's very straightforward. You have the middle aisle, which is called the nave, and now you've got 2 aisles on either side, and you'll be amazed what they're called. They're on either side, and they're called side aisles. Everything leads, it's designed specifically to also highlight when a priest comes in that there's a sense of ritual. Usually, these churches, I haven't examined everyone personally, okay, the apse end is to the east so that you can see the sun rising, and the front faces the west. Okay, I'm not sure which direction ours face. And here are the doors. So you can see, I always think this is kind of clever. I found one with the door open. See how tall the door is, and then they have this little secret door underneath that you go through. This is the doors of Santa Sabina. And then up in the far upper right, left-hand side, I'm sorry, my left, you'll see the crucifixion scene. It's actually kind of minor, isn't it? what's missing in this scene?
Crosses?
Amazing, isn't it?
Hmm.
No crosses. And also, something that you have to know about Italians, okay? I'm Italian, so I can say this. If you look at Italian crucifixes, for the most part, somebody can find an exception, I'm sure, they never show Christ as gruesome, bleeding profusely, and in wretched agony. You don't see that in Italians. Italians maintain a dignity to Christ on the cross. But if you go to the northern countries, the Netherlands, Germany, okay, I'm going to tell you, those crucifixion scenes are bloody. They are gruesome. So I think that this is the first manifestation. You understand that this is Christ, correct?
Yes.
Do you get the message that he saved us? Yes, with the two thieves. But is it gruesome?
No.
No, it maintains his dignity, and I think that this is important. Now, this is an unusual church that I haven't been to. This is St. Prudenziana in Rome. It's a central hall type church, like the basilica we saw. It has no transept, but don't worry about that right now. It has the original apse mosaic to the 4th century, but it was heavily restored in the 16th century. Tiny little church. It almost looks like a residence, and we suspect it probably was. There is the apse mosaic, and like I said, heavily restored. But what's going on here? And how is Christ, those of you who were at the Sunday lecture, how is Christ portrayed here?
Looks like he's judging.
What's the Last Supper look like? I mean,
Nope.
No?
Looks like he's in the form of a spirit, like he came back after the
But
resurrection.
he's raised for one thing.
He's raised, okay, so let's do this, because that's scale of hierarchy. He's raised, and his robe is actually gold and purple. Those of you who were at Sunday lecture, it isn't Christ as the Good Shepherd, is it? Is it Christ as the teacher and philosopher? Is it the baptism of Christ? Is it Christ as a Roman emperor? Don't you remember?
No.
Okay, well, he's seated at a throne. Is his head higher than everybody else's?
Yes, yes.
That is called scale of hierarchy. It means that person is center and more important. Okay?
Now, is that the Blessed Mother to the right?
No.
No, that's, she's the only, is it
You know, this is-
Mary Magdalene?
No, it's not. You
It's
make
not
a
Mary
good
Magdalene?
point, Virginia.
It's the only woman
Because-
in the picture.
How do you know what something means in a painting? Because you two who came, Cynthia, you came and said, what is this about? Who are those two people coming out of the tomb with the
Right.
Bible study question? Okay, the only way you can know, sometimes I may think I'm the intelligentsia, but I'm not. The only way that you can know for sure is to look at scholarly papers. You can't go to YouTube because kids make YouTubes all the time and they're doing their presentation for class and it may be totally wrong, okay? And since everyone gets a trophy, they're not going to be told. Now, you have to go into research because I wondered myself, who are those two women? But if I get up here and
I
guess,
only see one.
it's not going to happen. There are two
Where's the
women.
other? I
Where's the
only
other
see
woman?
one. and
She's
that's-
second on the right, down seated.
I don't see.
Still don't see her.
Well,
I see the
look
one
over
on
here
the
and there's a
bottom.
face. See the face on my
Oh,
right?
is she the second one?
Yes,
Yes,
that is
yes,
a woman.
yeah, okay, yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
oh, okay.
There's two.
They say that the standing female figures personify the major division of Christianity between the Church of the Jews and that of the Gentiles.
Hmm.
They can be seen offering their crowns to Christ like the 24 elders that are described as returning their crowns in the book of Revelations. Not my original thought, okay? So it's not something that you have to do a lot of research, and you have to realize with scholars, I belong to a group of, actually a paper availability on the internet, where scholars write papers on topics and you can get what they are, and then you can get the latest research. And so they have done some considerable research on this. On the top are the four symbols Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, okay? And the gold cross. Now, this is not a wooden cross. This is a gold cross embellished, supposedly, with jewel-like things, which tells you what? We've had a movement through the coming of Byzantium. Okay, in 500 there'll be the Byzantine Empire coming, but its influence here as well, with a lot of jewel-like richness and gold. So this is not just an ordinary Roman street scene. However, when I look, I'm only going to surmise this, but is everyone's face on that mosaic the same?
No.
And you know, when you see that, then you have to think, where the heck did those faces come from, right? So they could be real people, not necessarily maybe people that are important, could be people that are important, but people from that time. Does that make sense to you? And that's my theory. I don't have any documents to support it. Let's see. I think that's all I have. I think we move on to San Vitale in Ravenna. Oh, no, here is the interior San Prudenziana. So it's a very humble type church, but if you look above the nave arcade wall, and you know where that is, right? We're standing in the nave, see the altar down there? On either side, nave arcade wall, look, it's made of brick. Made of brick.
And the pews are so far removed from the...
You know, I don't know why that is, Virginia.
Yeah.
Remember, that would have been, 16th century, in the 1500s. So I'm not really sure why they're so far back. And the other thing that I notice here, I don't see any ambo and I don't see any pulpit
right.
either. Now, San Vitale in Ravenna. Now we're into the 6th century. And if you look, it's still a brick structure, isn't it? And when you look at it, San Vitale is a multi-sided building. It's not the basilica plan. So it was built, in the 20 years. And remember that Ravenna was the place where we had the Naonians, right, and the Arian heresy. Those two people lived in this town, two central beliefs at that time. So if you look, we have windows, but the more important thing is, if you look at the first picture, look over to the side. You see those arches that are attached to the building? Those are some of the first flying buttresses that will appear. So you say, okay, what's the big deal with a flying buttress? In any building that's getting tall in the structure, you need something somehow to support the walls. And what the buttresses do is they take, you see where it attaches at the top of the building. They take the weight from that wall and transfer it down to the ground. So they easily support that wall. And with as many sides as there are to that building, I think they wanted to make sure that it would stay. And there are buildings throughout history that failed, that were built high in Gothic cathedrals. There's one that was never finished. It got so high and collapsed, and it never was finished.
Is that what, don't we have that in Notre Dame?
Yes, excellent. Okay, guess what award you get? Sister Imelda's Intelligentsia Award.
To me, it's scary,
Why do you think it's scary? Do you think it's because the gargoyles are on Notre
Especially
Dame?
at night, they light it up at night, and it looks like, to me,
It looks like spider legs.
yeah, of course, inside the church, it's so dark inside the church, it's spooky when you walk in.
Oh, you do really think so?
Yes. Yes. You know what, when I felt better is when I found the niche, for the Virgin of Guadalupe. I felt like I knew.
Oh, that wasn't always there, though. The niche was
I was
there.
surprised to see it.
I was too, to see
Yeah,
it.
it wasn't always there. All right, here's the inside, and we're going to talk about a few parts of it, okay? Don't worry too much about the central dome area, but what I'm going to tell you is if you look to the exterior, you see the apse on the drawing to the right, down at the bottom, it'll say apse with the windows. Inside, this is considered a central plan church. I don't have my pointer, so I apologize. So you have the central area, the dome area. There is a dome over it. It's kind of squat, as you can see. It's multi-sided like the main building. Then The narthex is attached to it. Can you see it's kind of faded out, but it's to the upper left and it says narthex? So it's quite large.
Oh, yeah.
And you enter through 2 doors. Now, the sanctuary and the apse you should absolutely recognize, right? The apse is the thing down at the bottom, the little round arch. But there's something more. There's an ambulatory. And does anybody know what you do in an ambulatory? Comes from the word or the verb ambulare, which means to walk. So how many of you, when you said you went to Notre Dame, did you go through that one side door on the right? You walked down the side aisle, right?
Right.
You walked to the side aisle, you walked around the apse, correct?
Right.
And went down the other side aisle and then out.
Right.
Okay? That part of the apse that is rounded, that you walk around, is the ambulatory. It's taken from Psalm Vitale, you see? You'll go in and walk around the central area, okay? The exedra is just a little niche, okay? It used to be a conversation place in the basilica. Now, there's an upstairs. You see the stairs to the gallery? Over to the left, the first words. You go upstairs and there's a gallery. The gallery was meant for women originally. Now, you can't go to the gallery in Notre Dame. They won't let you up there. But it was meant for like overflow too. So if the church got too crowded, you could go up to the gallery. But in the beginning, women went to the gallery. Any questions? This is a central plan church. Central plan. Here's the inside. Because San Vitale is greatly influenced from the eastern part of the empire, you're going to see these beautiful mosaics. And we didn't get a chance to talk about this particular apse mosaic. You know where the apse is, right? It's Christ seated on the earth. Okay? And it is Christ in majesty. Now he is ruler of the world. All around there are biblical scenes, there are scenes from the life of Christ. Is there any space that is not decorated?
No, I can see, no.
So what is the purpose of this? If you go into this church and you go to Mass, how does all of this function? I mean, I know that you all think it's very nice. How does it function? What does it do?
It raises your mind to heaven.
You get it again, the Intelligentsia Award, Stella. And I guess here's the question that I pose to you.
There you go.
When you go in and you pray and you look around at all of this, does it make you feel very important and tall? Or does it make you feel insignificant to the creation of God? Okay? Does it take you to another place? When you go in that church and you sit or kneel to pray, does it take you somewhere else? Absolutely. Absolutely. So the greater question for you to ponder in your minds is, what do you want of a church?
To raise your level of mind up.
Well, the Amish worship in barns, okay? So that's what they want, you know? So it just is the question at hand. You know, what do you want or what do you need out of a church? So could you be in here for an hour?
Yeah, sure.
I sat in Notre Dame for half a day.
Wow.
You know, it's amazing. And New Year's Eve in Notre Dame is doubly amazing.
Oh, man.
It is. It truly is. Okay. We're going to move on to the Romanesque. Now, the Romanesque starts around 1000 and it continues to about 1150. It will then be followed by the Gothic, which we won't be covering today. So, if I say Romanesque, the term, what do you think it's derived from? one, you all? Romanesque means like Romans. It means like Romans. Okay?
Let's make it harder than it is.
So we're back to the hall-like space. Okay? We have 3 levels. In this case, for most of the Romanesque, we're going to see 2 levels that I'm going to show you. You're going to have a base floor, then you're going to have a gallery. Now, some, not all Romanesque churches, and I have to tell you that when you start doing these churches, it's kind of like when I was looking at the Diocese of Beaumont at their churches. No 2 were the same. And in fact, the original churches are not only patterned after a basilica, but patterned after castles as well. Fortress-like, heavy stone buildings. Okay, so if we look at the picture down below. You've got the nave arcade wall, right?
Yeah.
Because where are we standing? In the nave, looking at the nave arcade wall. Now, above it, that next set of arches, that is the gallery. Okay, used for women, originally meant to overflow crowds. Then, at the very top, what we have is something called a clerestory. If you're British, they use the term clerestory. But in America, we say clerestory. It is a window that lets light into the nave. Okay? They have to have buttresses to hold them up. They don't have a lot of windows. Glass is expensive. And you know, colored glass was originally from Venice. It was from the island of Murano. And I went to Murano to look at how they made glass. And what I was told there is that back then, if you were a glass worker in Murano, you could never leave Murano.
Right.
You could not take that information to other places.
So that's where the little Murano birds and little glasses.
At the very same workshops
it's beautiful.
that made the stained glass. Yeah, very much so. Okay. Any questions on that nave arcade wall? Because we're going to use these terms. So going from the top, we've got the clerestory, which is the windows that let in the light. Next, the gallery. The bottom, the nave arcade. That's the series of arches. And of course, that is the nave arcade wall, which makes sense, right?
So this is a tri-level, or it has 3 levels.
This one has 3 levels.
So
Yeah,
they-
actually, if they count the clerestory as a level. I
Yeah.
don't really. I count it as just a windows, but they evidently do.
So
How many people get this? Yeah? My students love this because they love to point these things out. Does it make you feel powerful? Now you're going to go over to our church and look for the clerestory, but guess what?
There is.
No.
I was kind of disappointed when, we'd been to Rome and then we came back and we'd seen all these beautiful basilicas and churches. To me, the cathedral that we have, it looks so stark. It just, to me, it looks very stark.
It's cold.
In comparison to the churches and the basilicas and stuff in
It's
Rome.
cold.
It's cold, yeah.
Well, you know, the churches that are being built, I recently was in St. Anthony of Padua for a funeral.
Yeah,
That
that's
is a
the other-
Romanesque style, but it is more stark than the latter St. Martha's.
Really?
St. Martha's has more decoration to it, I think, for the most part.
Yeah.
But we're going back to the new cathedral is Romanesque in origin. And actually, I'm going to show you a slide today that will show you where our church came from. Not the interior, only the front. Okay, one of the churches that we're going to talk about is St. Sermon. Now, remember the barbarians burned a lot of the wooden churches when they came in. They started to use brick and stone. Hallmarks, not always true because it's not a set formula, but one of the hallmarks is large twin towers.
Mm.
And they're huge. Now, my students would get upset when the towers didn't match. But in fact, maybe the first tower was built and it wasn't so tall, and then they built the second one and it was really tall.
Mm.
But my students have very strong opinions about what a church should look like, although I don't know how many have been in the inside of one. Okay, but they want those twin towers to match. The other thing is, look at the flat facade, the front of it. It's just flat. It's plain. Okay? What else there's something missing on the front. What, does anyone know what it is?
Crucifix.
Well, there's not a crucifix, but there's not very much sculpture. There's not very much exterior sculpture on a Romanesque church. You may see them above the portals, okay, which are the doors. And the reason being is when you would go into church, this I always thought was quite clever, they would put a really scary Last Judgment. Okay, so when you're going into church and you're looking up, you're like, whoa, I better be good, you know? So it's kind of a warning to you that you need to.
Which of those towers is built first? Because the one on the left has some differences as opposed to the one on the right. There's several differences there.
I have not a clue,
Yeah.
not a clue.
Mhm.
I don't know if I could find it out, I've never read.
Yeah, because from the top to the, well, from the bottom to the top, there's several differences there with respect to the door and the design on the tower there.
So you think the two towers are markedly different?
Oh,
Yeah, just up at the top, I think, more than anything else.
Mhm.
And I think that the windows, not at the very bottom, but the first level of windows, yeah.
And then the door, the side door. Yeah. On the left is different too.
You know, yes, it does seem smaller, doesn't it? It does seem
Linda,
smaller.
what was the reason for these towers? Was there anything going on in these
There-
towers?
Well, not in, I don't know in this one per se. Sometimes they have bells, but originally the bell towers were over the crossing. And we'll get to that in just a little bit. The other hallmark is barrel vaulting. Romans did barrel vaulting, and my students always said, tell me what a barrel vault is, because I don't understand. This is a barrel vault.
Oh,
See, I would call that an art.
I was colored an arch too, yeah.
Yeah, actually, it's stacked arches.
Uh-huh.
You know, if you drew a series of stacked arches, you would have a barrel vault, wouldn't you? And that changes primarily in the Gothic. Now, some Romanesque churches were completed on the outside and then finished later. And if you see other hallmarks other than the barrel vaulting, if you see some joists that are like this, cross groin vaults and things, they were done later. They were done later. So these churches were never really completely finished. They were always kind of a work in progress. And even to this day, because if you can look at the dirt and grime on there, and when I did my graduate work in Milan, and the Cathedral of Milan was always kind of grimy looking. Then all of a sudden I saw pictures and went back. It was like a white wedding cake.
Wow.
So
that's standing now.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, You could make an entire tour of Europe, which I would like to do, and I've done before, just Alan and I, just going from one church to another. That's all we do. And if you go during the holidays, they have concerts in the churches. And you know, we have a Christmas concert because the acoustics are so good for music.
Well, on the next pilgrimage that you conduct of the churches, we'll be there. We'll
Oh
go.
my goodness. You know, I used to be a tour guide.
There you go. Done deal.
we're ready to go.
We're ready to go.
This is Saint Etienne in Cannes, and the interior of this is done later. But again, look at this one. It's very similar to Saint Cernin.
We got benches. Oh my goodness.
Yes, they have benches.
Lots of them.
Well, they're like chairs. Now, this is the floor plan, and it's been expounded upon, so I'll just show you the basic floor. You know, can you identify where the nave is?
Yeah, the same part.
The center. Okay, can you identify the apse? It's the rounded part at the end. And the two aisles on either side of the nave are called side aisles. Now, do you see the little arms that come out? This becomes a precedent for churches. This is the crossing. It's the arms of the cross, and this is a Latin cross, okay? So the transept are the arms, and then right in the middle, you see the center dot? That is the crossing. That's where the nave intersects with the transept. I know, it's more information, right?
You know that reminds me a lot of the National Cathedral in Washington D.C.
Mm-hmm.
It's got the two side aisles.
You know, I'm not up on modern church architecture. I'm kind of rooted I pretty much end in the Baroque as far as what I study in church architecture. But I think that people are wanting to go back. We went in the late 50s and 60s to that kind of modern church, 50s and 60s, that modern looking church. And I think people are wanting now to go back because it's evidenced in St. Martha's, St. Anthony of Padua, the cathedral downtown. You know, we're wanting to go back to that. And actually, I ask my students, for those who do go to church, you know, but the ones that don't go to church have a very strong opinions about churches. And they all want the Christian church to be in the shape of a cross. They all do. I mean, I'm very shocked by this. In class after class after class, they say the same thing. Okay, this is Saint Sernin de Toulouse from France, about, 1100, and the towers are missing. So I know you're looking and saying, where are the towers? However, it does have a round window, which later will be the Gothic rose window that you saw in such places as Notre Dame. Look on the side. They have small buttresses holding up the building. Now what you have, and a Romanesque church can have both. It can have twin towers, and it can have a multi-sided tower over the crossing. So that is right over the altar, okay? And that was the original bell tower. Now you hear bells in all kinds of towers, but that was the original. And Romanesque, when you see a tower like that in back, that is the hallmark of a Romanesque church. Like the cross? Is there no doubt that this is a Christian church? No. Absolutely. And it's astounding. And the nice thing about the churches in Europe is, you see how it's got that nice circle around it? I mean, it's a community place. Everybody there is in church, hopefully, and they have different ceremonies and events. And so I think it makes it a nice center of the community. Again, brick and stone. Here's the inside. I didn't show you the inside of some churches because I didn't show you the top necessarily of some, because I want you to get a sense of the barrel vault. And here we have our bells. So they have chairs more than they have benches in these old churches. And I always wonder who sets them up. But they do have chairs, and not always kneelers. Not always kneelers. But you get a sense of when you come in that you're somewhere else.
But you
I love
know,
these
that's
churches.
true right now, because St. Martha's, until they built the new St. Martha's, they didn't have kneelers.
Don't get me started. I have bad knees, and believe me, that's the reason why I came here. So where are we standing in this church? What part of the church are we standing in?
The nave.
The nave. You know what happens? Once you become familiar with these terms, it just happens. You know? I can promise you that my students get diagrams for their test. They have to identify all the parts of the church. Yeah, they do very, very well on it. They seem to...
Very narrow.
It appears narrow, and the reason for that is, look, you're going to see another barrel vault, well, a sort of a barrel vault that's not, but you see?
Yeah.
It makes it seem higher. Now, the one thing about French Romanesque, I'm going to lead into something else for you, is how tall does that seem?
Very tall.
It seems very tall.
Yeah, and so in relation to God's creation, how are you?
Very small.
Very small and very in awe. Is that a bad thing necessarily? No, it's not. It's a cultural statement. Okay?
Yeah.
Do you like this?
Yeah.
Yeah. If this was your church, would you be happy?
Yes, sure.
Yeah.
And on the chips. No.
Now, I'm going to take you to Italy. And this is one of the most amazing churches I've ever seen. And I promise you, if you see similarities in the exterior to our church, you won't be far from wrong.
That's true.
The interior, no. I want you to notice, okay, it does have two towers, but one is considerably taller. I want you also to notice Do you see, and it's gonna lead you to something else. Do you see how it's like a white brick, a brown brick, outlining it all?
Yes.
I'm gonna tell you that an event that influenced Europe was in about 800, the Moors invaded Spain, took over. Islam was in Spain, predominant force, okay? With it, they brought their architecture, and if you've been to the Alhambra or any of those, you see all of this decoration that looks very much like it's from the Middle East. But in this church, you'll just see a few things that were influenced by it. This is on the street, and I will tell you, this in Milan, it's not in a good neighborhood. It's not in necessarily a good neighborhood. It's Sant'Ambrogio. And in fact, Sant'Ambrogio's body is in there. You can see it.
Yeah, it looks like that window there either was broken because it's sealed up, or is that just part of the?
No, I
That's
think
brick,
that's
isn't it?
part.
That's brick.
That's
Yeah.
part of the.
That's, you're right, I'm wrong.
No, it's just part of the arcade of arches. Okay, when you go to Sant'Ambrogio and you go in, it is Italian Romanesque. And when you get to Italian Romanesque, you're going to have a whole other feeling from French Romanesque. This is why I think this kind of reminds me of our church. Now in Italy, what's the climate? Mild. So they have a large courtyard, this is only part of it, where people can mill around outside, okay, because the weather is good. Now there's some other interesting things that are going on here. It's very much Roman-based, because you see the arches? Those are arcades of arches going down, but that's not the nave arcade wall. It's just... Does anyone remember the altar of Ratchet that was from the Sunday lecture that I had, Images of Jesus? It had quite an unusual portrayal of humans. Totally different from what we saw, and you'll see it, something similar. The altar of Ratchet is not here, but there's similar things. Now, look inside here. Not as lofty as what the French Romanesque churches are, correct? So, I want you to connect this to Italian thought. Italian thought is, from even the Romanesque times, that you will have some power, some say over your destiny. So if I go in here, I'm not necessarily an ant. I'm larger in the context of the church, okay? I'm larger. It's a different feeling. It has to do with Italian Romanesque. It's not about the loftiness. It's more about the hall-like space, okay? Someone asked, what are those poles going across? Those are were put in order to hold the arches stable. Okay? Where are we standing in this? Okay. So on the left side, we have the nave arcade wall, right? Above it, what's above it?
The arches, no, what do you call it?
The gallery,
Yeah.
right? Now, the ceilings are a little bit different because it's called a cross-groin vault, but it makes little domes. Now, all the way at the end, you see that structure by the altar? That is called, pardon me, that is called the baldacchino. That's a canopy for the altar. So you don't, if you went to St. Peter's, those of you who have been to the Vatican, there's a baldacchino over the altar. It's the same thing here.
But you know what I don't see is maybe, I don't see a pulpit or an anvil.
No. No, and I'm not sure why. Now, the idea of the pulpit that I was always taught in graduate school was that St. Francis is the one who really promoted the pulpit. Because he would preach in the street, and then he wanted a pulpit in the church as a raised place so that he could preach. Here's the baldacchino. Now the most amazing thing, and I don't have something close to it, is the altar, the front of it. If it's not gold, I'm surprised, and it's set with gems. And the church is always open, but nobody's around, and it's not in a good neighborhood. But I don't think it's ever been bothered. I mean, it's a very sumptuous looking front to the altar. So this is Italian Romanesque, just plain Italian Romanesque. Here is the plan of Sant'Ambrogio. So you see that the courtyard is almost as big as the entire church. It has the apse. It has two side little type apses, but what's missing is the crossing. There is no crossing. You can study Romanesque churches across Europe, and they will all have different qualities. Now, I found this very peculiar when I was first in Milan doing my graduate work. And by the way, I didn't get out of graduate school till I was 50. From the age of 47 to 50 was when I was in graduate school. But I came to this, and I thought, this just doesn't fit. There's something not fitting. I don't understand. You see all this interlacing, and you see it in the altar of Ratcheth. But this actually is derived from Viking style. And I think part of my head exploded when I figured this out. I had to trace the route of the Vikings to figure out what possibly this could be, because it doesn't fit, all this interlacing and this twining, right? And in fact, it was an influence from the Vikings. The Vikings, I think, made it as far south as Sicily, which I think is no easy feat, you know? Here again, now I'm not sure if this is the Annunciation, I'm not sure what the title of this capital is, but you can see the figures look very different, don't they, from what we've seen in the apses. It's a Lombard style from the Italian section of Lombardy. It looks very different. It looks very flat. It looks very stylized. Okay, now we go to the last Romanesque that we're going to study, and it's Italian. It's Tuscan Romanesque, which differs from Italian Romanesque because Italian Romanesque uses the breaker stone, right? Large spaces, which you're going to see in some churches throughout Tuscany. But this is Tuscan Romanesque, and it has a kind of a numerical symbolism to it and a geometry. Has anyone ever seen churches that look like this before? First of all, this is a baptistry, and it was not uncommon in the 1100s and even before to have a separate building for baptisms, apart from the church. So the Duomo, the Cathedral of Florence, is just right across from it. So you had the Cathedral of Florence, and then you had the baptistry. And I thought this was kind of a good way to look at it. Now, this has a reliance on geometry, on logic, on math, on symbolism, and somewhat symmetry. If you look, there's a lot of threes repeated in this, right? Could represent the Trinity, right? And then, of course, you've got the arches, very Roman, but you've got this inlaid stone, the inlaid stone, which I think is quite beautiful. If you see this building, my students always say, please, can we have Tuscan Romanesque on the test? And I thought, gee, they must be really interested in it. No, it's like you see this, and what style is it? Tuscan Romanesque, okay? Siena has cathedrals that are this way. The Cathedral of Florence is this way. You'll see several different churches, and they've been maintained beautifully. Here is the inside of the baptistry. It has a dome. Now you see that dome? It is called an ogival dome. Ogival, which means, just remember, it's egg-shaped. It's shaped like half of an egg. The other true dome is shaped like half of a beach ball. Okay? And the Cathedral of Florence is very famous also for its dome that is ogival. Inside, again, it's kind of a central plan. I've got a strange picture to show you. This is the sides of all of the baptistry. So if I took that octagonal building and just opened it up like this, this is what it would look like. So it has all of the beautiful built around it, all of the beautiful scenes and different registers. When things are put like in lines like that, that's called registers. It goes back all the way to Sumerian times.
Linda, are those windows at the very top Not at the very top, but.
Yes, those are
So
windows.
that the lighting.
Yes, and then also it has an oculus. Let me get to that. See at the top? So now I've put it all back together again. And it's an oculus. Oculus means eye. Yes,
Is it paint or is it mosaic?
it's mosaics, I think. So the oculus lets in some light along with the windows. But this is the baptistry. So it would have been used primarily for baptisms. Nothing really goes on there. I think there's a few baptisms you have to make arrangements a lot in advance. But most of the time when you go in, it's, you know, just tourists. It's empty. Now this is a curious picture, and it has a Byzantine. Remember we talked about the Byzantine being otherworldly. It has a Byzantine factor to it. And the one thing that was curious to me, it's Christ, by the way, as Pantocrator. And the other thing is that he is the king of creation. Now if you look at this, you're going to see something pretty strange. Just look at it for a while and see if you can find something strange about this picture. The drapery, by the way, is stylized. Is it natural? No, it's stylized. Nobody has drapery that falls like that. But what else do you think is strange?
I think his feet are strange.
I saw those and I thought, I've got to find the meaning of this, and I can't guess.
Yeah.
I can't guess. So what came out of this?
Yeah, it doesn't look normal, like a normal
And he
foot.
looks heavy.
He looks very heavy, absolutely. Now,
And that hair.
It looked like a monkey feet.
well,
Yeah.
they're unusual for sure, but there's a
Yeah.
reason for it.
Oh.
First of all, Christ has a nimbus, halo,
Mhm.
cross, okay? We're looking at a more otherworldly type of representation of Christ. But the reason for the feet, that's what I was looking for. What are the feet?
Is it because his toes were broken? Is it because of broken toes? Or-
No, I had to do research. I mean, I'm telling
Okay.
you, I can't, I had some ideas, but I was totally wrong. So
Okay.
in that case, when people say, what do art historians do? We are detectives. We are visual detectives. And I had to find this out because I knew you were going to ask me what's going on with
Yeah,
the feet.
yeah.
Okay. The image of the feet relates to the king of creation.
Critical by nature.
Under his feet, and I'm putting it in quotation marks, has two meanings in the Old Testament. First, it means authority over creation. Marveling in Psalm 8, for example, that God has responsibility to care for his world. David sings, "What is man that you take thought of him, and the son of man that you care for him? You make him rule over the works of your hands, and you have put all things under his feet."
Wow.
So the question is, these feet probably could handle all things, couldn't they?
Sure.
These are not just tiny little dainty feet. And if you draw attention to them, because they kind of have a life of their own apart from the whole figural study, correct?
And they stand out.
And his hand,
The left hand is strange.
is it in the right hand?
It's backwards.
Yeah.
It's-
You see
the
how?
thumb's in the wrong place.
Yeah. You see, this hand.
I'm
is
doing this,
stretched
wait a
out.
minute.
But now.
Oh,
right, yeah.
no.
Not the left.
Here it is.
Is it
This
like
hand
this?
is like this, and that hand is actually like this.
Uh-huh.
See, here's my finger, here's my thumb.
Actually,
like
I
that.
thought that was his palm. Yeah.
It looks
This,
like a
I know
palm.
because of the whiteness.
Yeah, yeah.
But the little finger is on top,
Mhm.
So
and
it's
the
like
thumb
this.
is at the bottom.
It's like this.
Yeah. I have to do this a lot. Ellen sees me making some very strange poses, but I had to get that. Now, I can't do the feet, but I can do the hands, and they're correct, but they are twisted
Yeah.
in that particular way.
You know,
Also, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Linda, if you ever go to the National Cathedral in Washington DC, in the main part of the church, you know,
Mhm.
you see Christ, just like that.
With the feet?
But, just like, no, not the feet, but the hands stretched like that. The only thing
Is
is.
this one like that? This
just-
one's like this?
Just that's
This one's like
stretched
that?
like this.
Okay.
But what I'm saying, it just reminds me of that. But it looks like judgment. because his eyebrows are way up like this, you know, and when
Absolutely.
you walk into the church, it looks like he's judging you, he's looking over you like that.
You know, one of the biggest fallacies that I think, this is my theory, okay, so please don't label me a heretic, is that today I find that people have morphed Christ into something else. It's no matter what you do, okay, everything is okay. Everything is okay. Does everybody go to heaven?
No.
Well, I'm going to tell you, the feel-goods today think everybody goes to heaven.
We
You
think
know?
they go straight to heaven.
Yeah.
You
So,
know, and to me, his face is sort of like questioning, like, why? You know, why?
mhm.
That's what I see. I don't see it like Estelle's interpreted. I see it more like a questioning of, you know, why has this been done to me? Or
I like that face better than the one at the National Couture, because the one at the National Couture looks like his eyebrows are like.
Does he look more
Way to
stern?
judge you.
Does he
really?
look more stern?
Oh, yeah, a lot more.
Now, let's talk about space in this, because is this deep space or flat space?
I feel
Deep.
Why would it, no, it's flat.
Is it
Yeah, because he, what is he sitting on? Because
His throne?
there is no throne.
No.
No?
It's like if, it's just like a painted background in back of
And
it.
see, his arms are so outstretched that there is no,
But he looks like a
that
city.
he's like all encompassing that space.
And he defies space, you know,
It's his face.
Yeah.
Mhm.
entirely.
Yeah, but the fact that that is round in the back, those little curved
Mhm.
things.
Oh, I see what you're
Pushes
saying.
it back.
But it's
pushing it back.
kind of an, it's not an effective way to push it back, but I see what you're saying, that it kind of would do this.
Yes.
Uh-huh, but the way it's painted, it's so flat, because the pattern doesn't, if something recedes in the distance, the pattern would get smaller. But this pattern stays the same. So now you've got something going on in your head about space. So what does that tell you? Now this is the senior level questions here.
Uh-oh.
What does that tell you? Estella said it pushes back, and I said, no, but it's flat. Look, it doesn't. So what does that tell you? You're in a space that is incomprehensible.
He's sitting on air.
Bingo. You should get little art historian certificates. These were from this is from the panels, and don't ask me what the bottom is. I looked and looked and looked and could not find, and I can't make it up for you. But the thing that I liked about this particular panel from this is, who can identify the far left upper register panel? The tree with the two figures are? Okay.
Yeah.
This is where it gets me. Okay, now look at the middle panel. What's going on here?
Still Adam and Eve,
Adam
They're
and
being
Eve.
judged, judging
but
him.
he's chastising him.
And what is Adam doing?
Covering his stuff because he's.
No. Adam is pointing to her. It wasn't me.
she's the
It's
one.
her.
She did.
She did it.
I
She
can't
made
see
me
that
do
face.
it.
I mean, now what kind of a statement is that?
Yeah, yeah.
She did it.
She made me do it.
Yes.
And she's like, no,
She's like, what are you saying?
Who, me? Typical woman. Who, me?
They clearly got the message. Remember, the population wasn't literate.
Yeah.
So you could go into church, I'm sorry, but I am illiterate about these bottom registers. I really don't know what's going on there. I can't effectively say, I could guess. Now, what's happening in the last register?
They got cast
they
out of
cast
paradise.
out of him.
And who cast them out? It's an angel with how many wings?
It looks like
I don't
1,
know.
2, 3. I can see 3.
There's 6 wings.
St.
Oh,
Michael,
Lord.
St. Gabriel, somebody.
6
Wow.
wings. And not only that, but this angel can take those wings and disappear behind them. Seraphim. This is a seraphim. Except there's a problem. A 6-winged angel, I think, is a seraphim.
Wow.
But this angel has legs, and I didn't think that seraphims had bodies. I thought they just had heads. So they might have just adjusted this. But he's casting them out.
Okay,
Okay.
maybe it's the way the picture is, but it looks like the legs don't really connect to the body from where I'm sitting.
Oh, there's red wings. The tips of the wings are
Oh,
red,
okay, yeah.
and they go down there. But he's casting them out. But I'm going to tell you that God didn't believe the story. It was her. I didn't want to do it. She made it. So I
Man.
thought,
To
Yeah.
this day.
There's Jim.
But he was supposed to be there to guard her. God put him in
Thank
charge
you.
of that garden,
To
and he
lead.
should have
Well, you
protected
can tell
her.
that his excuse didn't hold water.
Amen.
It's about the same when the students tell me their dog ate their homework.
Yeah.
But the devil did tempt Eve, and she fell for the
He knew
temptation.
who to- That's how smart the devil is.
You
He
know.
went to somebody that was weak.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And this one, I think this is my last slide, but I love this one because, and some of you, who was at, let's see, who was at the Mary lecture?
The one,
Estella, yeah, were you at the Mary
here.
lecture?
We were all here.
Where we
Oh,
were.
okay.
You weren't here,
No,
but we
I
were.
didn't make it.
We were here. That was the one last week, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Did you walk in front of?
Last
walked in
Monday?
front of Jim.
You were there, right?
Yes.
Okay, here's my
Last
question. When I say iconography, when you hear that, that's an important word, right? Put that in your vocabulary and people will tremble. When I say,
I can't pronounce it.
when I say, well, I do that all the time to my students, what is the iconography? And they all just look at me, they go into a trance. Okay, the iconography, the definition is very easily, it's the story of the work. What is the story of the work? So can someone help me tell me the story of this work? It's a mosaic from there.
The Blessed Mother, that's right. Is that the Blessed Mother of baby
Yes.
Jesus? Yes.
And she has, remember, what did we talk about? It looks
She
like
sort
a
of looks like
blanket
she's
around
in a pod.
Yeah,
It
you know
looks
what?
like she's in a
It's
pod.
kind of like a body halo. The mandorla that we talked about, that is Arabic for the word almond. She's almost in a mandorla. It keeps her safe. Okay, so then we have the angels, right? And look at the size of the angels. Pretty good size, right? Now look in the lower right-hand corner, what is down there?
You can't see.
And don't distinguish what it is.
It looks like somebody with a little cane, but.
A cane, and the, what below is sheep. So who are they?
Shepherds.
Shepherds. Now, here is the $64,000 question.
Saint Joseph.
Joseph.
Saint
What is Joseph doing?
Yeah, he's resting.
And where is Joseph usually put in these pictures?
In the little corners.
He's kind of clueless as to what's going on.
He's never really into.
No,
Into.
no, it happens in the Renaissance more.
Yeah.
But here it's like he's really not a part of
Totally
it.
out of it,
Okay, and baby Jesus already has a halo.
yeah.
Okay,